The line above the water stain on room 318's ceiling was slightly uneven. It wasn't a major flaw, just the sort of thing you only notice when you have nothing else to do except lie on your back and stare. I'd been watching it since somewhere around 4 in the morning, calculating how many layers of paint it had taken to cover whatever leaked through from the floor above. My right arm was heavy in a fiberglass cast, running from knuckles to mid-forearm. My left side felt like someone had driven a fence post through my ribs. Every time I tried to take a full breath, Harlan Pettis, the attending physician, had stopped by 2 hours ago, looked at my charts, and told me in that quiet clinical tone doctors use when they're trying not to give you bad news that I'd be staying at UT like medical center for a while. "Your kidney had a rough evening, Theodore," he'd said. "Let's let it rest." I didn't tell him that I hadn't rested in 30 years, or that resting was usually when things went wrong. The accident had happened at the intersection of Kingston Pike and North Shore. November in Knoxville gets dark early, the kind of heavy, wet cold that settles into the pavement before the streetlights even flicker on. I was stopped at a red light in my truck, listening to the heater fan rattle in the dashboard when the box came out of nowhere. When the box truck came out of nowhere. No horn, no screech of brakes on wet asphalt. Just a sudden, violent shudder, the sound of tearing metal. And then silence until I woke up on a gurney, with a paramedic asking me what year it was. My phone, lying on the bedside table next to a plastic cup of water, buzzed. I picked it up with my good hand. The screen showed 8 missed calls from the same number. Clifton. I waited through 3 rings before pressing accept. "Dad?" His voice came through the speaker, carrying that familiar, hurried pitch he always got when he was trying to fix a situation before it became a problem. "Dad, are you there?" "I'm here," I said. My voice sounded thin, like dry paper. "Look, the hospital called me an hour ago," he said, the words tumbling out over each other. "They said you were in an accident on Kingston Pike. They said you were stable." "Are you stable?" In the background, behind his voice, I could hear the distinct, rhythmic rustle of palm fronds in a light breeze and the faint, tinny sound of steel drums playing over a resort sound system. Then, closer to the receiver, a low, urgent whisper. "Serena." "I'm in room 318, I said, slowly, keeping my breathing shallow so my ribs wouldn't catch. 3 fractured ribs, a cracked wrist, and a bruised kidney. "I'm staying a few days." Silence on the line. Then the murmur of Serena's voice again, quick and sharp, like someone giving directions to a driver who didn't know the route. "Dad," Clifton said, his tone shifting into that reasonable negotiator voice he'd used since he was 16. "Here's the thing. Serena and I are in Cancun. We just landed yesterday. The resort has a strict 72-hour cancellation policy, and if we pull out now, we lose the whole deposit. Plus, if you're stable, there's not really much I can do from a waiting room, right?" Another pause. The sound of Serena's hand brief covering the phone microphone before Clifton came back on. "We're scheduled to fly back Thursday evening anyway," he continued. "It probably makes more sense for us to stay here, finish out the stay, and come straight to the hospital from the airport on Thursday. You'll still be there, right?" It wasn't a question. It was a request for validation. I looked back up at the stain on the ceiling tile. I thought about the 39 years I'd spent building Merit Logistics, the 4 in the morning wake-up calls, the cold coffee, the tax returns, the payrolls I'd covered out of my own savings when the transport market crashed in 2008. I thought about the house on Lyons Bend, that I'd signed over to him 3 years ago because he said he needed a proper base to launch his consulting firm. "Enjoy your trip," I said. "Dad, wait, it's just at the resort." I pressed the red icon on the screen, cut the call, and laid the phone face down on the thin hospital blanket. For 10 minutes, the only sound in room 318 was the low hum of the fluorescent ballast in the ceiling. Then the phone buzzed again. A local 865 area code. I answered on the third ring. "Theodore." Mortimer Vance's voice was as dry and measured as it had been for the 22 years he'd handled my corporate filings. He didn't ask how I was feeling. Mortimer was a probate lawyer. He dealt in documentation, not bedside manners. "I heard about the truck on Kingston Pike from my assistant. Her brother works dispatch for the county." "I'm alive," I said. "So I hear. Which is why I'm calling you now instead of afternoon." A brief pause, the sound of a fountain pen cap clicking into place. "3 weeks ago, your daughter-in-law came into my office on Gay Street. I didn't say anything." "She didn't book through your account," Mortimer continued. "She used her maiden name, Serena Voss, and scheduled a general consultation on estate administration. She spent 45 minutes asking very specific questions about majority shareholding transfers in privately held transport companies upon the incapacitation of the primary shareholder." The room seemed to get a little colder. "Did she mention me by name?" I asked. "She didn't have to," Mortimer replied. "She brought a copy of Merit Logistics 2021 corporate filing, the public version, and asked if an oral promise made by a founder regarding future equity distribution could be contested if the founder experienced cognitive decline due to trauma or medical sedation." "What did you tell her, Mortimer?" "I told her that my retainer was with Theodore Merritt, that any discussion regarding his estate would require his presence, and I suggested she leave before I billed her for the coffee she'd drunk," Mortimer said flatly. "She thanked me, smiled, and left. I made a memorandum for your file that afternoon. I'm telling you now, because I know where your son is currently, vacationing." "Cancun," I said. "Precisely," Mortimer said. "Take care of your ribs, Theodore. We will talk when you are discharged." The line went dead. At 10:30 a.m., Nadine Cobb walked into the room. She didn't knock like the residents did. 2 quick taps followed immediately by the door swinging open. She knocked once, waited 3 seconds, and stepped inside, carrying a tray of fresh IV bags. She checked the drip line on my right arm, noted the blood pressure readouts on the wall monitor, and then looked down at me through her wire-rimmed glasses. "Your son called the nurse's station 20 minutes ago," she said, her voice entirely devoid of judgment. "He wanted to know if you were on heavy pain medication and if you were clear-headed enough to sign documents if a notary came by." "What did you tell him?" "I told him this was an ICU overflow unit, not an office depot," Nadine said, adjusting the plastic slide clamp on the tubing. Then I hung up. She picked up her clipboard, turned toward the door, and paused with her hand on the handle. "People show you who they are when the weather turns bad, Mr. Merritt. Some people grab an umbrella, and some people look around to see if anyone's watching, so they can push you into the gutter." When she left, I picked up the phone again and dialed Barnaby Finn, my head of operational security at the terminal on Middlebrook Pike. "Theodore," Barnaby answered before the second ring. I was just about to head over there. "Stay at your desk," I said. "I need an audit." "I already ran it," Barnaby said quietly. "As soon as I got the call about the accident last night, I pulled the server logs for the corporate account. And 6 weeks ago, someone used Clifton's old admin credentials, the ones from when he was nominally listed as Director of Operations back in 2022, to access the main secure ledger, Barnaby said. They didn't transfer funds. They set up an automated rule. Every financial summary, every trust distribution document, and every draft of your personal cell testament sent to or from your primary email was set to auto-forward to a secondary server. Whose server? An external domain registered to a limited liability corporation called Voss Holdings, Barnaby replied. Registered in Delaware 4 months ago. Serena's maiden name. I pulled my good hand across my face. The skin felt rough, dry. How long has that rule been active? 42 days, Barnaby said. And Theodore, 30 minutes after the news of your accident hit the local traffic blotter last night, someone logged into the system using those same credentials and attempted to execute a pre-authorized power of attorney draft that had been uploaded to the staging folder 2 weeks ago. Did it go through? No, Barnaby said, because I flagged those credentials as dormant 18 months ago. The system accepted the login, but locked the execution sequence in a sandbox environment. Nothing moved, but they think it did. Keep the sandbox active, I said. Let them think the system is processing. Understood. And Barnaby? Yes, Theodore. Effective immediately, cancel the monthly stipend to Clifton's account. Close the corporate card registered to his name. And call the property manager at the Lions Bend house. Tell them the lease-to-own agreement is terminated due to non-payment of property taxes. There was a long pause on the line. The taxes were due last Friday, Barnaby noted. Clifton was supposed to wire his portion. He didn't, I said. So the option reverts to the trust. Execute it. It's done, Barnaby said. I hung up and laid the phone on the tray table. The heavy, measured footsteps coming down the hallway didn't sound like the staff. Nurses moved with a quick, light rustle of scrubs. Doctors walked with the rapid, uneven pace of people constantly behind schedule. These footsteps were steady, deliberate, carrying the weight of work boots on linoleum. The door swung open. Emmett Caldwell stood in the threshold. He wore his heavy canvas work jacket, stained with gray concrete dust along the hem, and his steel-toed boots were worn at the heels. His hair was flattened on one side from wearing a hard hat all morning, and he had a small streak of dark grease across the back of his right hand. He didn't look like an executive because he wasn't one. He was the head fleet mechanic who had maintained my first 3 delivery trucks. Back in 1994, the man who had worked 60-hour weeks alongside me when we were sleeping on cot beds in the back of an unheated warehouse off Cherry Street. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked over, pulled the heavy plastic chair away from the wall, and sat down beside the bed. You look like hell, Theodore, he said, his voice low and gravelly from 40 years of diesel fumes and cold mornings. The truck was bigger than mine, I said. Emmett looked at the cast on my arm, then at the monitor ticking behind my head. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out an old leather-bound pocket notebook held together with a rubber band, and laid it on the bedside table next to my phone. I brought the maintenance logs for the heavy rigs, he said calmly. And I brought something else. He slid the rubber band off the notebook and opened it to a page near the back. 2 months ago, Clifton came down to the shop, Emmett said. He brought a fellow with him, some guy in a gray suit from an equipment liquidator out of Atlanta. Clifton told the boys in the yard that you were planning on restructuring the fleet by the end of the year, selling off the heavy haulers, and transitioning the company into an asset-light brokerage. I watched him. I never mentioned a word of that to him. I know, Emmett said. That's why I didn't let the liquidator pass the front gate. But Clifton had papers, Theodore. Real-looking ones. Corporate seal, signature line, everything. He told me you'd signed off on the liquidation rights 6 months ago, back when you had that bout with pneumonia. I looked out the window. The yellow maple tree in the courtyard was dropping its leaves one by one onto the dark asphalt below. He was waiting, I said softly. He was helping it along. Emmett corrected. He took out a second mortgage on that Lion's Bend, placed 3 weeks ago, through a private lender in Nashville. The repayment terms are predatory, short-term, high-interest balloon payment due at the end of this month. He used the fleet as collateral, Theodore. Or at least, he presented forged corporate resolutions, claiming he had the authority to pledge the fleet. The pieces didn't just fit. They locked together with the heavy, metallic sound of a deadbolt sliding into place. The trip to Cancun wasn't a vacation. It was a cover, a pre-planned window of absence, so that, when the financial notices hit my desk, he could claim he was out of the country, unreachable, blameless. The power of attorney attempt last night wasn't an impulse. It was the trigger on a mechanism they'd been building for 6 months. They needed me incapacitated just long enough for the default notices to clear, for the private lender to seize the title certificates, and for the asset transfer to become irreversible under Tennessee commercial law. "Where's the lender based?" I asked. "Nashville," Emmett said. "Voss Capital Management. It's registered to Serena's brother." I closed my eyes for 3 seconds, feeling the dull, persistent throb in my side where the ribs were cracked. When I opened them, the ceiling tile was still there, the dark stain unchanged. "Emmett," I said. "Yeah, Theodore? Call Mortimer. Tell him to pull the original partnership deeds from the vault in the basement of the courthouse. The ones from 1998, before we incorporated." Emmett's eyebrows pulled together slightly. "The ones with the cross-default covenants? The ones that state any attempted encumbrance of corporate assets by an unauthorized party automatically triggers an immediate buyback clause of all family-held equity at face value of the original share price," I said. $1 per share. Emmett sat quiet for a moment, looking down at his greased hands. Then a small, tight nod came. "And the house on Lion's Bend?" "The trust owns the deed," I said. "The lease was contingent on good standing within the firm. Since he attempted to pledge company assets to a third party, he's in breach of Section 4. Issue the notice of default today. Give them 48 hours to clear their personal belongings. He's in Mexico until Thursday," Emmett pointed out. "I know," I said. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, my phone rang again. It wasn't Clifton. It was Serena. I clicked the screen and placed the phone on my chest, listening to the ambient noise of the Cancun hotel lobby in the background. Clinking glasses, a fountain, laughter. "Theodore," she said, her tone smooth, polished, perfectly balanced between concern and efficiency. "Clifton told me you hung up earlier. He's very upset, as you can imagine. We're both just sick about this whole thing." "I'm sure you are," I said. "Look," she continued, her voice dropping into a confidential register. "We're trying to see if we can get an earlier flight. But everything is booked solid until tomorrow night. In the meantime, the corporate office sent over a notification about a routine filing that needs your electronic signature to clear the end-of-a-month payroll. It was sent to your client portal. Since you're indisposed, Clifton can handle it from here if you just approve the access bypass code. She paused, waiting for me to ask what code. Serena, I said quietly. Yes, Theodore? The weather in Knoxville is very cold today, I said. The leaves are coming off the trees. A brief hesitation on the line. Theodore? Are they giving you morphine? The filing you're looking for isn't in the portal, I said. It's on file, with the Knox County Chancery Court. Mortimer Vance delivered it an hour ago. Silence. The sound of the hotel lobby seemed to fade out as she pulled the phone closer to her ear. What filing? Her voice lost its smooth edge, replaced by something sharp and cold. The order of injunction, I said clearly. Freezing all accounts associated with Voss Holdings, pending a judicial review of unauthorized access to Merit Logistics Network infrastructure. The local sheriff's department is currently serving notice at your brother's office in Nashville. You can't do that, she whispered. Clifton is your son. Clifton is a man who left his father in an intensive care unit to stay at a beach resort, I said. And you are a woman who thought a 3-week head start at a law firm made you clever. When you land at the airport on Thursday, do not go to the house on Lyons Bend. The locks were changed at noon. Your belongings have been placed in 3 climate-controlled storage units off Texas Avenue. The keys are at the front desk of the terminal. Theodore, listen to me. Enjoy the rest of your stay, Serena, I said, and ended the call. I set the phone on the bedside table. Nadine came back in at 4 to check my vitals. She looked at the blood pressure monitor, noted the numbers on her sheet, and gave a small nod of satisfaction. Looking better, she said. Pressure's down. I feel better, I said. Good, she said, tucking the pen into her pocket. Because Dr. Pettis says if you keep this up, you might actually get out of here by Friday. I looked up at the ceiling, at the white tiles, the humming light, and the small brown spot in the corner that had survived 3 coats of paint. It was still there, but it didn't bother me anymore. Some things don't go away just because you try to cover them up. Eventually, you just have to fix the leak underneath. He didn't say anything at first. He walked across the room, dragged the chair from the far corner, the one the nurses never seemed to use, and placed it right beside the bed without asking. He sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, a habit he'd had since he was a kid whenever he was fully focused. Then he looked at me and said, "What do you need?" Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "I'm so sorry, I should have come sooner." None of that performative concern that fills up hospital rooms and forces the person in the bed to expend energy comforting everyone else. Just 5 words. Direct, simple, completely genuine. I told him I was managing. 3 broken ribs, a fractured wrist, a bruised kidney. He nodded slowly, letting the information register, processing it, not just reacting to it. How did you find out? I asked. Mrs. Quell, he said. She called me this morning. Said she saw the ambulance outside your place Monday night and learned you'd been moved here. She tried calling you, but couldn't get through. He paused. I had a concrete pour this morning I couldn't walk away from. You can't just leave a job site before the concrete sets. He looked down at his hands. I'm sorry it took me so long to get here. He said it the way he did most things. No drama, no expectation of a specific response. Just a clean, simple apology, and then he sat there. I told him it was fine, and he nodded. Then he stood up and walked out without a word. I watched the door shut behind him and found myself staring at the phone right where I'd left it after talking to Barnaby. I flipped it over. For a second. 21 missed calls from Clifton. They hadn't come all at once. At first, the gaps were long enough to pretend he had patience. Then they got closer together. The last burst came between 1 and 2:00 p.m. 4 calls in 40 minutes. Then a pause. Then 2 more around 3. Turns out a man who can't interrupt his vacation can still run a pretty relentless phone campaign from the resort pool. I flipped the screen back down. 12 minutes later, the door opened again. Emmett walked back in, holding 2 cups of coffee from the cafeteria downstairs. Without any fuss, he set one on the table next to me and kept the second for himself. He sat back down in the corner chair and leaned forward again, taking up that same quiet, attentive posture. I looked at the cup. No sleeve. He'd grabbed a cup without a sleeve, which meant he'd specifically asked for it that way. Or just knew to do it. I carefully lifted it with my good hand and took a sip. Black, no sugar, just a drop of cream. Hot enough to drink, but not so hot you had to wait. Perfectly made. I looked over at him. You've been making it like this for as long as I can remember. He looked at his own cup, not raising his eyes. Saturday mornings. You'd have the ledgers spread out over the kitchen table, coffee already brewed. You'd let me sit there next to you, even when I was too young to understand what any of those numbers meant. A short pause. You always made it the exact same way. I had to look out the window. The Knoxville sky had shifted from amber to that pale slate gray of a late November afternoon, flattening the light across the rooftops and the bare branches along the hospital drive. The maple tree I'd been watching all day had shed another layer of leaves. The few that remained caught the fading light, holding on tight as if they weren't quite ready to let go. We sat like that for a while, the two of us, the coffee, the fading afternoon. No agenda, no act. It was the kind of silence that didn't need filling because it was already full of something real. Some people force you to keep talking just to feel connected. But with others, the silence itself is the conversation. Emmett had always been the second kind. After a while, he glanced over at the phone lying face down on the table. His eyes rested on it for just a second. "Clifton," he said. I nodded. He didn't say another word. No unsolicited opinions, no prodding, no emotional display that I'd have to manage. He just turned back toward the window, took a slow sip of his coffee, and watched the November sky over Knoxville, just like I was doing. That was all the moment called for, and after the morning I'd had, it was more than enough. After 10 p.m., the hospital takes on a completely different feel. During the day, UT Medical Center is full of purposeful motion, footsteps echoing down the halls, carts rattling past, the periodic beep of monitors being checked and adjusted. It's a place fueled by urgency, even a quiet kind. But once Nadine dims the hallway lights and the shift change settles in, the whole building drops into a different gear. Slower. And, in a way, far more real. The quiet stops, trying to be anything other than what it is. Emmett had left just after 8. He stood up from the corner chair, tossed both empty cups into the trash can by the door, and said he'd be back tomorrow after his shift. No drawn-out goodbyes, just a simple statement of the plan, followed by the heavy sound of his boots, echoing down the hallway until it faded away. Now, close to 11, the only sound left was the low hum of the ventilation system and the distant murmur from the nurse's station at the end of the hall. I reached into the pocket of my hospital gown and pulled it out. It was a small copper bracelet with a simple button clasp, its edges worn completely smooth from years of handling. Over time, the bright metal had aged into a deep, soft amber, the color of something that had weathered decades without losing its shape. I rested it in the palm of my left hand, turning it slowly in the dim light. Lenora had pressed it into my palm the morning she went in for surgery. Not the night before, and not during some long, emotional conversation about all the things we should have said, just right there in the hallway outside the prep room. Quick and direct, the way she did everything. "Hold on to this for me," she'd said. "I have a weird feeling, and I don't want to leave it in a locker." She was 29, with a brain aneurysm. The kind of thing that only reveals itself when it's ready. No warning, no asking for anyone's permission. The surgeon had used the word unpredictable. Standing in that hallway, I learned that unpredictable was just the clinical way of saying, there's nothing you can do. I carried that bracelet in my wallet for 27 years. It went with me through every lease renewal, every quarterly report, every tough conversation held behind closed office doors. It was there as Merit Logistics grew from 4 employees in a shared space down by the river bend to what it is today. It was there through Clifton's childhood, his 20s, and those 4 months he spent at the company before deciding the work wasn't for him and moving on. Through all of it, just a small piece of copper in my wallet. Sitting in that quiet room, my mind didn't go back to the hallway, outside the operating room. It went back to the kitchen. 3 weeks after Lenora passed, in the house in North Knoxville. At 2 in the morning, I walked downstairs for a glass of water and found 6-year-old Emmett sitting at the kitchen table in his pajamas, systematically eating a bowl of cereal like a kid who'd been given a job and was determined to see it through. His feet couldn't even reach the floor. He looked up when I walked in. No tears. Just that direct, unblinking focus that I later realized was his way of taking in the world. "What do we do now, Uncle Theodore?" Not "I miss her." Not "I'm scared." Just a practical question from a 6-year-old boy in a dark kitchen at 2 in the morning who clearly felt someone needed to ask it. I sat down across from him and told him as honestly as I could that we'd figure it out together. That as long as he needed it, this was his home. I'd made a promise to his mother, and I intended to keep it. He nodded, finished his cereal, put the bowl in the sink, and walked back upstairs. I sat at that table for a long time after he left. I kept that promise. I really did. I gave Emmett a home, an education, a foundation. When he was old enough to work, I gave him a job at Merit Logistics, and I watched him approach it with a level of dedication I could never fully explain to anyone else. If people asked why a dock supervisor had my direct extension and a standing lunch with me every Thursday, I never bothered trying to explain it. But there was another promise I'd never fulfilled. A quiet pledge I made to myself in that hospital hallway 27 years ago. It was the belief that the person who helps build something real should be the one who inherits it. I spent 10 years telling myself that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping a promise, that staying fair and keeping everyone happy were close enough to be interchangeable. But they aren't. I see that clearly now, the way you only do when it's 0 p.m. in a hospital room and you have nothing left to do but face the truth. The phone on the bedside table vibrated. A message from Barnaby Finn. "The report will be ready Wednesday night, as promised." There's more here than I initially thought. It's significant, I read it twice, then set the bracelet down next to the phone. The copper caught the dim light, holding on to it. I carefully pushed myself up against the pillows. The taped ribs flared up in sharp protest, but I'd already learned how to breathe through the pain. Outside the window, Knoxville lay quiet, under the cold November sky, completely indifferent. The city didn't care about Barnaby's report, the weight of a copper bracelet, or the gravity of a question asked by a 6-year-old at 2 in the morning. It was just a city, doing what cities do. It's significant, I read again. I put the phone down and looked up at the ceiling of room 318. So be it. The difference between Tuesday night and Wednesday morning came down to Rosalind Fay. She arrived at 8:15 a.m. with a canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder, moving with the kind of sharp efficiency that only comes from doing a job long enough to skip all the fluff. No long introductions, no adjustment period. She walked straight into room 318, set her bag on the chair by the window, and extended her hand a firm, brief handshake that communicated everything it needed to, without a single wasted word. "Did you sleep?" she asked. "Have you eaten this morning?" I told her I'd managed a few hours and that the breakfast tray had already been cleared away. She gave a single nod, pulled my chart from the foot of the bed, and started scanning it with complete concentration, looking for something specific. It took her less than 30 seconds to spot it. "They have your anti-inflammatories scheduled after meals," she said. "That medications works better when it's already in your system before food, not after. I'll have that adjusted before noon." She spoke like she was stating an absolute truth, not offering a suggestion or an opinion for me to consider, just identifying a mistake that needed to be corrected. In her first 45 minutes, Rosalind rescheduled my medication timeline, confirmed my next imaging appointment with the floor nurse, and submitted a maintenance ticket on behalf of the 3rd floor to engineering. Right when she walked in, she'd noticed the air vent above the door was stuck on low. Something I'd vaguely sensed over the last 36 hours without recognizing it as a solvable issue. She spotted it, made 2 quick calls, and by 10 a.m., a mechanic had come and gone, leaving the air in room 318 circulating the way it was supposed to. I laid back and watched her work. 9 years, $8,000 a month. A resort in Cancun with a strict cancellation policy. And Rosalind Fay had accomplished more in 45 minutes than anyone had in that entire arrangement. I didn't say it out loud, but the thought was crystal clear. It was the kind of clarity that comes when something you've known for a long time finally presents itself in a way you can no longer ignore. She stepped out briefly to coordinate the medication changes with the nursing staff, leaving me alone in the quiet room with the phone resting on the table. Barnaby's report wouldn't be ready until tonight, but I knew better than to just sit around waiting. Instead, I let my mind keep doing what it had been doing since before dawn, assembling the pieces in order, figuring out the pattern. Clifton's old login credentials, the auto-forwarding rule Serena on Gay Street, asking about cognitive decline and business asset distribution. And then there was the piece that had surfaced during the night, the one I hadn't fully looked at until now. 2 years ago, Clifton had come by the house on a Sunday afternoon. He'd seemed relaxed, almost easygoing, which I'd mistaken for maturity. A son finally taking an interest in the family business and wanting to know how things operated. He asked about the company structure, the investment accounts, the operating capital, and the trust setup I'd established a decade earlier. And sitting at my own kitchen table, I'd explained it all to him, clearly and in detail, genuinely believing that this was what it looked like when a grown man decided to take his responsibilities seriously. I'd handed him the map. I just hadn't realized I was giving him the blueprint to tear down everything I'd built. Rosalind walked back in and took a seat in the chair, possessing the calm efficiency of someone who understood her presence in the room didn't require constant chatter. I said, 9 years, $8,000 a month. And 2 years ago, I sat at my own kitchen table and walked him through every single account we owned, thinking he was finally growing up. Rosalind looked at me with that direct, unvarnished focus that I'd come to realize was simply her way of listening. "How long did it take you to see it?" she asked. "This morning," I said. She stared at me for a long moment. Rosalind Fay wasn't one to peddle pity, but there was a quiet steadiness in her eyes. The kind born from sitting beside enough hospital beds to know that realizations come on their own schedule. And when they finally arrive, the only thing to do is let them land. Then she opened the folder on her lap and moved to the next item on her checklist. That was a comfort in its own right. Not the sentimental kind, but the practical kind. The kind that tells you this is the reality, and there's still work to be done. At 10:28 a.m., there was a knock at the door. Not the quick, routine tap of the hospital staff that I'd come to recognize. This knock was slower, more deliberate. The sound of someone who knew the person inside well, announcing his presence, but raised to always ask permission before stepping through a door. I looked over at Rosalind. She was already closing her folder. Himnan, standing up from her chair with the calm composure of someone who understood when a room needed a change of arrangement. She gathered her tote bag, tucked her clipboard under her arm, and walked toward the door without needing to be asked. "Come in, Emmett," I said. "Close it behind you." The door clicked shut, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. Emmett stood just inside the doorway, taking in the scene without showing a trace of emotion. He looked straight at me, not at the cast, not at the IV drip, and not at the mechanical equipment humming softly by the bed, but at my face. He had the sharp look of a man reading details far deeper than a surface check. Whatever he saw, his response was simple. He pulled the chair out from the corner. He didn't ask what and waited. He didn't ask what was wrong. He could tell. The answers needed to come in their own time, and he'd always had the patience to wait for them. I started with Mortimer's call. The woman on Gay Street, 3 weeks ago. Her questions about estate planning, and that specific phrase. Cognitive decline at the time of signing. Then I told him about Barnaby, the old login credentials that should have been revoked years ago, the auto-forwarding rule built right into the internal system, and the external email address pieced together from 2 last names into a neat corporate Nuddle. Emmett listened without interrupting. His face remained remarkably calm. Not a forced performance, but a genuine composure, processing the facts instead of just reacting. It was the exact same way he'd sat at the kitchen table as a 6-year-old with a bowl of cereal, facing a situation far too heavy for the moment. When I finished, a long silence filled the room. Finally, he spoke up. "There's something else you need to know. I've thought about telling you more than once. I should have said something 8 months ago. I kept quiet because I didn't want to be right. I was waiting." In the same plain, matter-of-fact tone he used for everything, he laid it out. Davidson Freight Partners. A $2.3 million annual contract, the third largest in Merit Logistics history, negotiated over 18 long months. During that time, Clifton had dropped by the Riverbend office 3 separate times, acting casual, offering the same excuse each time. "Just passing through. Wanted to see where my dad operates. Figured I should know the layout better." Emmett had been polite, showing him around when asked, not thinking much of it. Merit Logistics lost the bid. 2 weeks later, my Walter Odom heard through a contact at Davidson Freight that the winning competitor's proposal had contained highly specific pricing structures, internal data that wasn't available in public filings or industry benchmarks, data that could only have come from the inside. Emmett had been the lead manager on the Davidson account. His name was right on the folder. When quiet rumors about a leak started circulating through the company, he was almost let go after a single tense meeting. After things settled down, I went back and checked the building access logs, Emmett said. The Riverbend file room uses a keycard reader, so every entry requires a badge scan. He paused. The badge Clifton used during those 4 months he worked at the company was never deactivated. The logs show he accessed that room during all 3 of his visits, twice while I was out of the building. I sat in complete silence. I kept the records, the access logs, and the email threads documenting the timeline, he said, looking down at his hands. Years of real manual labor had left them rough and calloused, with stains that never quite washed out after a shift. I kept telling myself I wasn't certain, that the timing could just be a coincidence, that it didn't have to mean what it looked like. He stopped. Emmett, my voice was lower than I expected. How long have you been protecting me from my own son? He didn't answer right away. He stared down at his hands for another long moment, as if making sure he had the answer right before speaking it out loud. Long enough, he finally said. Too long. There was no drama in it. He didn't say it for effect. He said it because it was accurate. And Emmett simply wasn't capable of being anything less. I reached into my gown pocket with my left hand and gripped the copper bracelet. I didn't pull it out, just held it tight. The worn metal, the smooth clasp, the familiar weight I'd known for 27 years. I let the room stay quiet for a moment. Some realizations can't be neatly packaged into sentences. The most honest thing you can do is give them the room they need, rather than forcing them into something easier to swallow. After a moment, I said, "Send me the access logs and the email chain, tonight if you can." "I forwarded them this morning," he said, "before I came over." Of course he had. We didn't talk for a while after that. It wasn't the awkward silence of 2 people trying to avoid a subject, but the quiet that settles in when enough has been said. Both of us understood that adding more words would only dilute the truth of what had already been spoken. Outside the window, the cold November sky over Knoxville had turned from a dull gray to a flat, washed-out white, the universal sign that a cold front was rolling in. The maple tree by the hospital drive had lost nearly all its leaves. Just a tiny cluster remained, stubbornly clinging to the branches. Their amber edges had darkened, curling inward against the wind, holding on long after it made any sense to. I watched it for a while, thinking about 18 months of negotiations. A $2.3 million contract. A building badge that should have been canceled 4 years ago but wasn't, simply because small companies tend to overlook administrative details. And the people looking to take advantage know precisely where those blind spots are. At 2:17 p.m., the phone on the bedside table lit up. The screen displayed a single name, Clifton. I looked over at Emmett. He met my gaze and gave a subtle nod. No pressure, no instructions, just a silent confirmation. "Your call." I picked up the phone. Before uttering a word, I pressed the record button, then brought it to my ear. "Hey, Dad." The voice came through clear, carrying that easy resort tone, the relaxed composure of a man sitting in the sun with a drink nearby. I'd listened to that voice for 39 years. I knew its patterns, the way you know the weather in the town you grew up in. You learn which gathering clouds mean real storm, and which ones are just passing through without leaving a mark. This time, his tone was cautious, warm on the surface, but calculating underneath. Across the room, Emmett sat in the chair by the window, his forearms resting on his knees, staring out at the Knoxville sky without looking at the phone or at me. He maintained his usual posture whenever something needed to play out without his interference, fully present, but completely stepping back to let things take their course. Clifton led with the money transfer, framing it as a casual question. First, was there a problem with the account? Was it a glitch on the bank's end? Giving himself a convenient out to avoid setting a direct tone. But when I confirmed the hold on the transfer was intentional, his approach shifted. Curiosity turned into concern, and concern quickly turned into demands. "Dad, we have real obligations here." The condo. Then Serena's voice cut in from his end, much closer to the microphone than she realized. "Raymond, we've been completely reasonable about this whole. My name is Theodore." A sudden silence fell over the line from Cancun. "My name has been Theodore for 64 years, I said. For 39 of those years, you've been my son, and for 3 of them, you've been his wife. I realize remembering names can be tough, Serena, but 64 years should have given you plenty of time to get it right." Another pause followed, longer this time. Clifton recovered the way he always did, smoothly redirecting the conversation before the silence could define it. His voice dropped into a tone of deep concern, the kind he reliably pulled out whenever his initial angle stopped working. He asked about my injuries, whether I was in pain, if the hospital was treating me well. He insisted he wished he could be there, claiming the logistics at the resort were far more complicated than they sounded, but promised they would head straight to the hospital the second they landed back in Knoxville. I let him keep talking. When you aren't listening to gather information, but to map out the boundaries, to catch what's being said versus what's being carefully avoided, and to spot where natural conversation hardens into rehearsed answers, letting the other person speak becomes a powerful tool. Clifton was always good at filling the silence. I'd spent far too long failing to see that filling a silence and actually saying something aren't the same thing. They might sound identical from the outside, but underneath they couldn't be more different. When he finally paused for breath, I said, "Clifton, I'm going to ask you a question. Take your time before you answer." He waited. "Someone used your old login credentials at Merit Logistics. The ones from the 4 months you worked here 4 years ago, to try to access the company investment accounts. There were 4 separate attempts over 6 months. Those credentials were never deactivated, which was an administrative security failure on our end, I admit." A brief silence hung on the line. "Now, what I need from you right now is to tell me you had nothing to do with it." The line went dead quiet. I could hear him draw in a breath as if preparing to speak, but no words came. It wasn't the silence of a man formulating an answer. It was the quiet of someone running a completely different set of numbers in his head, realizing the board was far more locked down than it had looked just minutes before. In the background, I could clearly hear the faint whistle of the ocean breeze and the distant sound of music playing by the resort pool. The carefully designed soundtrack of a place built to make the real world feel far away, manageable, and entirely irrelevant. Still, no answer. "Take all the time you need," I said softly. "I've got the whole afternoon." The long silence dragged on over the line. Then the connection cut out. I looked down at the screen. Call duration, 41 minutes, 17 seconds. I saved the recording before setting the phone face down on the mattress. The hospital room settled back into its daytime quiet. The vent Rosalind had gotten fixed that morning hummed steadily, circulating the air just as it was supposed to. Outside, the pale sky had darkened into a heavy, uncompromising gray, signaling the cold front rolling in from the Appalachia Mountains. Unyielding and completely indifferent to anything happening inside room 318. Emmett was still by the window. He hadn't moved an inch during the entire phone call. After a moment, without turning around, he said, "He didn't answer the question." "No," I said. "He didn't." Emmett stood up calmly and reached for his jacket on the back of the chair. He put it on with his usual straightforward efficiency, making no dramatic gestures and offering no commentary on what had just transpired. Some things don't need commentary. They just need to be recognized, so you can move on to the next practical step. "I'll be back at 7:30 tomorrow morning," he said. He was already at the door when I called his name. He stopped and turned slightly, letting me know he was listening. "Thank you," I said, "for everything today." He looked at me for a second with that direct, unvarnished focus, the exact same way he'd stared over a bowl of cereal at 6 years old, asking for nothing and offering no performative comfort. Then he gave a single, firm nod and walked out. I looked at the copper bracelet sitting on the bedside table next to my phone. That worn little piece of metal had stayed tucked away in my wallet for 27 years. And now, for the second day in a row, it lay exposed to the room, catching the faint morning light. Tomorrow was Thursday. There was work to do. The knock came at 7:30 a.m. sharp, not 7:28, not 7:33. Exactly 7:30, the way a man knocks when he respects both your time and the weight of what's waiting on the other side of the door. Over 24 years, I'd learned that Emmett Caldwell's punctuality wasn't just a habit. It was a statement of character. I'd been awake since 5. The bruised kidney made sleeping past a certain point. A losing battle anyway, so I'd given up on rest. By the time Emmett's knock landed on the door of room 318, I had already read Barnaby's report twice and set it beside the copper bracelet. I was sitting there in a specific kind of calm. The quiet that settles over you when you've fully processed a truth, and nothing left in it can surprise you. It had taken Barnaby 2 days to compile the report. It took me 40 minutes to read it. The gap between those two numbers showed just how much had been quietly piling up, long before anyone thought to look. "Come in," I said. He walked in carrying 2 coffees from the cafeteria. Just like Tuesday, black, no sugar, a splash of cream, hot enough to drink right away. Without a word, he set one on the table and sat in the corner chair with the other, watching me with that sharp reading everything gaze. He'd brought through that door all week. He didn't ask if I'd slept. He didn't need to. And Emmett was never a man to ask questions he already knew the answers to just to fill the air. I picked up Barnaby's report from the table. 14 pages, single-spaced. "The forwarding rule was set up 9 months ago," I said. "From inside the system, using credentials with administrative access. Every email with contract, revenue, or investment in the subject line was automatically copied to an external address." I set the pages down on the mattress beside me. S. Voss. Merritt. The same address Barnaby flagged on Tuesday. Emmett listened, fully attentive, without interrupting. His face held that deep, characteristic composure. The look of a man processing facts, rather than waiting for his turn to speak. He had a rare way of giving you his complete focus without performing it. 9 months, I continued. This wasn't someone testing a door to see if it was locked. This was someone who knew it was open, walked right in, and built a pipeline to drain information on a schedule. Emmett didn't bring up the Davidson freight deal. There was nothing left to add. That chapter had been laid bare yesterday, and he understood, as he did with most things, that repeating it would only dilute what was already clear. After a moment, I said, Mortimer Vance is coming at 10. He's bringing the documents and 2 witnesses from his office. I paused. A lawyer coming to a hospital room to handle paperwork for an immobilized client is routine. It's legal. It happens every day in this state. Emmett looked across the room at me, his gaze steady. What are you planning to do, Theodore? It was the first time he'd used my first name instead of my title. Not out of disrespect, but out of a solemn weight that required a real name to carry it. I'm correcting a mistake that has lasted for 22 years, I said, before someone else corrects it, in a way that suits them instead of the truth. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, holding his coffee cup, looking down into it as he weighed his words. Whatever you decide, he finally said, that's your right, not mine. It was never my call. He set the cup down. I just want you to know I understand that. I exhaled slowly. I know, I said. That's part of the reason. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, asking for no further explanation. He didn't need one. That was Emmett. He never needed every edge spelled out to see the full picture. We sat with our coffee as the early morning sun came through the window of room 318. It was that pale Tennessee amber, thin and horizontal, laying long strips of light across the bare floorboards. Outside, Knoxville was starting another Thursday. Traffic was building on the streets below, and the university campus a mile away was settling into its morning rhythm. An ordinary day moving at its normal pace, completely unconcerned with what was about to happen on the 3rd floor of this hospital. There was a sobering clarity in that indifference. The world doesn't pause for your life-altering moments. It keeps moving, and the only choice you have is to finally, clearly, and without delay, decide to move with it. At 9:45, the door pushed open. Nadine Cobb stepped in with her usual morning efficiency, checking charts and IV lines. She gave the room that quick, professional scan of someone who could read a room's entire atmosphere in under 10 seconds. She looked at both of us, then settled her eyes on my face, just like she'd done on Tuesday morning. This time, she didn't ask any preliminary questions. Instead, she said, "Are you ready for whatever today brings, Mr. Merritt?" "Yes," I said. "I've been getting ready for about 22 years." At 10:03, they arrived. I heard them coming down the hall before the door even opened, the distinct, measured footsteps of people walking with clear purpose. 3 deliberate knocks, and then the door opened. Mortimer Vance stepped into room 318, wearing a dark gray suit, carrying a thick leather portfolio under his arm. Behind him stood 2 young staff members in white shirts, each holding a duplicate folder. They stood near the foot of the bed, quiet and professional, fully understanding that their role was simply to witness, not participate. Mortimer walked up to the bed and extended his left hand. Without a word, he remembered my right arm was in a cast. I shook it. "How are you feeling, Theodore?" "Clear-headed," I said. He gave a single nod. "That's all I need to know." He laid the portfolio on the visitor's chair and opened it with practiced care. He understood that these pages weren't just routine paperwork. They were the legal execution of a heavy decision. The old will was already sitting on the bedside table. I had pulled it out earlier. 22 years old, the paper slightly yellowed around the edges. The terms inside reflected a version of me from a completely different lifetime. Mortimer glanced at it, then set it aside with quiet finality. He laid two separate sets of documents on top of the portfolio and began walking through them. The first was a living trust agreement. Mortimer read through it, line by line, in that steady, reassuring cadence built over 40 years of practice. He knew that clarity mattered far more than speed. The moment I signed and activated it, this trust would transfer 75% controlling interest of Merit Logistics to Emmett Caldwell. Not upon my death and not conditional on any future event. The transfer of control would be immediate and absolute. I looked at Emmett while Mortimer read. He sat in the corner chair, forearms on his knees, holding the exact same posture he'd kept all week. His face was entirely unreadable. Not suppressing a reaction, but simply trying to process a reality he had never asked for and didn't yet know how to carry. He didn't say a word, and I didn't ask him to. The second document was the updated will. It would take effect through standard probate after I passed, confirming and reinforcing everything established in the trust. But it also created something new. The Lenora Merit Literacy Foundation, based in South Knoxville, which would receive the remaining 25% of the estate's liquid assets. Mortimer paused briefly there and looked at me. I had mentioned Lenora to him years ago. Not the details, just the name. He understood what that name meant on a legal document and didn't need to hear the story repeated. Before Lenora passed, she had volunteered for 3 years at a reading program in South Knoxville. Every Saturday afternoon, she would take young Emmett with her. He'd sit beside her in an oversized jacket, watching her help adults learn to read words most people took for granted. I hadn't been back to that building in 27 years, but I knew exactly where it stood, and I knew what her name on the door would mean to the people walking through it. For Clifton, the will left the house in Maryville. 3 bedrooms, a private dock, valued at $420,000. More than enough to build a comfortable life, and more than enough to ensure no reasonable court could claim he had been disinherited out of spite. Mortimer also pointed out, per my explicit instructions, that Barnaby Finn's 14-page report, including the email forwarding logs and building access records, was attached as an official exhibit in the legal file. He made no comment on it. He simply stated the fact, then moved on. He placed the pen on the mattress in front of me. The 2 witnesses stepped up to either side of the bed. I picked up the pen with my left hand. My right arm was still immobilized from knuckles to elbow. I began working through the pages one by one. My left-handed signature was rough, the letters uneven, but the intent behind every stroke was absolute. I moved steadily through the stack, initialing where required, signing where indicated, until I reached the final page. At the bottom, right above the signature line, it read, "The Lenora Merit Literacy Foundation, South Knoxville, Tennessee." I held the pen still for a single second. Then I signed my name. Mortimer packed up the documents with deliberate care, like a man wrapping up a long overdue job. The 2 witnesses signed their sections, gathered their copies, and left the room without any fanfare. The door clicked shut behind them. Room 318 fell quiet again, the deep, settling silence of a space that had just witnessed a monumental shift. "It's done, Theodore," Mortimer said. "Yes," I said. It's done. He held his portfolio against his chest for a moment. Before speaking, Clifton's connecting flight came through Atlanta this morning. According to the schedule, he should be landing at McGee-Tyson Airport around 4 p.m. I turned my head toward the window. The November sky had flattened into a featureless gray, the kind that heralds the first real frost of the season. I know, I said. The afternoon slowed down to the usual hospital crawl. The morning noise cleared out, replaced by a quieter, heavier rhythm as the building settled into its shift. At 3 p.m., the door swung open and Rosalind walked in carrying a cup of coffee. Without me having to ask, it was made right. Black, no sugar, splash of cream. But right behind her was someone I hadn't invited and certainly hadn't expected to see. The man behind her had broad shoulders and a quiet, deliberate way of moving, the unmistakable posture of someone who had spent decades doing real, physical work. He held his cap in both hands in front of his dark flannel shirt. His work boots were cleaned up, though clearly well worn. He looked at me with the expression of a man who had finally run out of reasons not to say what he'd been holding back for a long time. "Mr. Merritt," he said, his voice low and raspy. "I'm Walter Odom. I manage the yard at the Riverbend warehouse. 19 years this coming March. I knew exactly who he was. I hadn't seen him in person for a while, but his name had appeared on enough operational reports over the years that I recognized his handwriting before I even recognized his face. I don't know if it's my place to say this," he said, "but I figure if I don't say it now, I never will." I gestured toward the empty chair. He sat down right on the edge, holding his cap in both hands. He laid it all out in that plain, straightforward way men who work with their hands always do. No preamble, no dramatic build-up, just starting with the parts that mattered and moving forward from there. When we lost the Davidson freight account, the whole mood down at the Riverbend terminal shifted. Questions started floating around the yard, the way they always do in a tight company. Not through official channels, but in the quiet spaces between shifts, in the way people suddenly stopped talking whenever certain names came up. Emmett's name was mentioned more than anyone else's. He'd been the lead manager on the project. That account folder had been his responsibility, and Emmett hadn't said a single word in his own defense. He hadn't pointed fingers, and he hadn't shown the building access logs or the keycard records to anyone who hadn't specifically asked to see them. He just absorbed the suspicion, kept his head down, and went back to work. 3 weeks after Davidson went sideways, a second contract started shaking, Walter said. Harrington Supply. Smaller deal, but we couldn't afford to lose 2 accounts in the same quarter. He looked down at his cap, turning it slowly in his hands. Emmett stayed late for 3 straight weeks to pull Harrington's account back into line. No overtime pay, every single night. As far as I know, he never mentioned it to a soul. He paused, his thumbs tracing the worn brim of the hat. Then a shipping order went out with a pricing error. Our mistake, not the customer's. Would have billed Harrington about $4,500 more than the quote. A small thing, normally. But when trust is already running thin, small things turn into deal breakers. He looked right at me, his gaze steady. He knew what was at stake. So Emmett covered the difference himself. $2,800 out of his own pocket. Processed it as a standard adjustment in the filing system, so it wouldn't trigger any internal red flags. I only know because I caught him doing the math at his desk, and I pushed him on it. The air vent overhead hummed rhythmically. Outside, the sky had turned the dull gray of old pewter. Flat uniform, the exact shade that shows up right before the temperature drops for good. He told me to keep my mouth shut about it, Walter said. I gave him my word, and I kept it for 8 months. He met my eyes. But I'm breaking it today. Then he told me about the phone calls. Over the last 3 years, 3 separate logistics firms larger than Merit, one in Nashville, one in Chattanooga, and one out of state, had reached out to Emmett directly. Walter had overheard half of 2 those calls from the main floor at Riverbend, and a colleague had passed along the third. Every single time, Emmett's answer was identical. I'm good right where I am. No room for negotiation, no playing the offers against each other for a raise. Just a plain, unvarnished statement, followed by him going right back to whatever job he was doing before the phone rang. The outfit in Nashville offered him 35 to 40% more than what he makes here. Walter said quietly, I'm dead certain of that number. He set his cap on his knee and stared at his hands for a second. Emmett was never going to tell you any of this. I know he wasn't. Because I've known the man a long time, and that's just not how he's built. He's not the type to walk into your office and say, look at what I did for you. He doesn't have a self-serving bone in his body. He stood up, not waiting for a response, and placed his cap back on his head with a single, calm motion, like a man who had delivered his message and was ready to step back out into a world free of hospital rooms and leather portfolios. I just thought you should know, he said. That's all I came to say. He gave a brief nod to me, and Rosalind then walked out, the door shutting softly behind him. Rosalind stayed by the window, the coffee tray resting on the sill beside her. She glanced over at me once, then looked away. Not out of awkwardness, but with the professional discretion of someone who understands when a moment doesn't need extra commentary. She stepped over to check my IV line, keeping completely silent. It was the most respectful thing she could have done. I sat there quietly, letting Walter's words sink in. I'd known Emmett Caldwell for 27 years, yet there were still sides of him that could completely catch me off guard. Not because he hid them, but because he simply never considered them worth bringing up. He just did the work, left no paper trail of his sacrifices, and went home. The maple trees behind UT Medical Center had finally surrendered every leaf they had left to give. Only a few scattered amber clusters still clung to the upper branches. A stubborn bunch holding on long after it made any practical sense. The rest had fallen over the course of the week, now lying flat across the dark asphalt, resting where they landed with a quiet, easy grace. Emmett brought a wheelchair into the room without asking. He said it was hospital policy, and he was right. My kidney was still under observation, and the attending physician had explicitly warned against standing for too long. I didn't push back. Some battles are worth fighting. A debate in a hospital corridor isn't one of them. By Thursday afternoon, I'd learned how to tell the difference. He wheeled me out through the side exit and stopped beside a concrete bench under the bare branches of the last maple tree. I carefully worked my way up from the chair and sat down on the bench. He pulled one of the plastic chairs from a stack against the exterior wall, placed it across from me, and leaned forward with his forearms on his knees, taking up that same quiet posture he'd held through every heavy conversation this week. The air outside was sharp and cold, the distinct, biting chill of late November. It was a cold that made no apologies and offered no compromises. You could Smell wood smoke drifting through the air, carrying the crisp scent of something moving down from the mountains. Walter Odom came to see me this afternoon, I said. Emmett closed his eyes for a brief second, exhaling a long, slow breath through his nose. I told him not to. He didn't listen. No, Emmett said quietly. Walter doesn't listen when he thinks he's right. In this case, I said, he was right. Emmett stared down at the ground between his boots, offering nothing in response. I told him about what had happened that morning. Mortimer arriving at 10 Hoffy. The leather portfolio, the two separate documents, the living trust and the updated will, each serving its own clear purpose. 17 pages in total, signed with my left hand while my right arm remained locked in a cast from wrist to elbow. The handwriting was jagged, but the intent behind every signature was absolute. Emmett stayed quiet for a long time, longer than he had at any other point over the last 4 days. Finally, he spoke up. You didn't have to do that, Theodore. It's 27 years overdue. Don't argue with a man who has a cast on his arm and 3 broken ribs, he said softly. You're not the one who had surgery. I have the cast, the ribs, and a kidney that just survived a very rough week. Don't split hairs with me, Emmett. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a full smile, but the barest hint of one. He looked down at the pavement, then back up at me, that brief flicker fading back into his usual calm composure. Another silence settled over us, deeper this time. I reached into the pocket of my gown with my left hand and pulled out the copper bracelet. I had carried it in my wallet for 27 years. Through board meetings, quarterly audits, and every major chapter of Merit Logistics. It had been in my pocket all week, accompanying me through the crash, the hospital bed, the phone calls, the legal papers, and every single conversation that had unfolded in room 318. I held it out toward him. Emmett looked at it without moving for a moment. He recognized it instantly. I could see it in the sudden, deep stillness that washed over his face. A quiet different from his usual calm. It was the look of a man coming face to face with a piece of his life he rarely allowed himself to touch. He took it from my palm. His hand closed around it slowly, his fingers wrapping around the worn copper like he was holding something he was terrified to drop. He didn't say a word for a long while. He just sat there with his fist clenched, staring up at the maple branches above us, watching the last few amber leaves catch the late afternoon light. If she were here to see all this, he said finally, his voice steady and quiet, she'd have a lot to say. Lenora would have cried first, I said. She always cried first. Then she would have told me I should have done this a long time ago, and then she would have gone to make coffee. A subtle shift passed over Emmett's face. A quiet change at the edges that I only caught because I'd spent 24 years paying attention to him. Then it broadened into a genuine, completely unguarded expression that looked nothing like his usual stoicism. A real smile, one that came from deep down, completely unbidden, that lasted for 4 or 5 seconds before settling back into his quiet composure. In 33 years, I had maybe seen that smile 12 times. It only ever showed up when something caught him completely off guard, slipping past his natural restraint. I looked up at the bare branches above us and just let the moment rest. Then, my phone vibrated in my pocket against my leg through the thin fabric of the gown. Once, twice, 3 steady pulses. Not an incoming call, but a text notification. Then silence. I pulled it out. A single message was sitting on the screen. I'm at the hospital, 3rd floor. We need to talk. I read it once, then read it again. Not because I didn't understand it the first time, but because I wanted to be completely sure of how I felt reading it. What I felt wasn't surprise. It was just a quiet sense of readiness. The same readiness Nadine had asked me about this morning, the kind that had been building piece by piece since Tuesday. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and pushed myself up from the bench slowly, letting my ribs voice their sharp protest before taking a deep breath and leaning into it. Emmett was already on his feet. He didn't ask to see the message, and he didn't ask what it said. He just stood there, the copper bracelet still gripped tightly in his hand, watching me. "He's upstairs," I said. Emmett gave a single nod. "Then let's go up," he said. The elevator doors opened, and Clifton was standing in the corridor alone. No Serena. The handle of the carry-on bag beside him still bore a bright Delta baggage tag from his connecting flight, printed at the gate and still attached, because he hadn't had the time or reason to take it off yet. The Cancun sun had left its mark on his face, that warm, golden hue that comes from spending 5 days at a resort, making a person look rested and composed on the surface. But his eyes told a completely different story. He looked at me sitting in the wheelchair, then at Emmett standing behind it with one hand on the push handle, and then back at me. The hallway was completely empty. Late afternoon in a hospital corridor has a specific kind of quiet. That still pocket of time between the end of visiting hours and the start of the evening shift. "You cut off the transfer," Clifton said. "Yes, and the will." "That too." He shifted his weight slightly. "Dad, whatever he told you." "Clifton." My voice was as flat and steady as it had been all day. No anger, no heat. Just a level line measured by facts. "This has nothing to do with what anyone told me. This is about what I uncovered myself." I reached into the chest pocket of the jacket Emmett had brought from my room and pulled out a thick document envelope. Inside was a printed copy of Barnaby's 14-page report. It contained the complete email forwarding logs, showing the external address on every single line. It had the time-stamped access records from the Riverbend terminal, detailing the 3 visits and the 2 off-hours entries. And it held a small flash drive containing the clear audio recording of our 41-minute phone call from Tuesday afternoon. I held it out to him. He didn't take it right away. "Before you say another word," I said, "I need you to understand something. I'm not angry. Anger requires surprise. And I stopped being surprised by you about 5 years ago. Right around the time, I stopped expecting honest conversations and just started writing checks instead." I let the words settle in the quiet hallway. "This isn't an accusation. It's a final accounting, and a large part of that balance falls squarely on me for letting it go on this long." Clifton's jaw tightened. His practiced composure held on the surface, but underneath it, something was unraveling. It was the look of a man desperately calculating his next move, only to realize every exit on the board had just been closed. "Here is what changes," I continued smoothly. "I am done paying for your attention. I love you with everything I have, the way a father loves a child he raised from the ground up. Even when that child breaks something fundamental inside him, that love doesn't just disappear. It hasn't changed today, and it won't change tomorrow." I paused, holding his gaze. "But I will no longer fund a life built on deception." His eyes darted over to Emmett, a long, cold glare searching for a scapegoat. "This is because of him," he said, though it sounded more like a desperate statement than a question. I slowly shook my head. "No, son, this is because of you, and choices that were made long before this week ever started." Everything in that envelope was built by your hands and Serena's. He looked back at me. Something shifted in his face. A quick, unfamiliar change that flickered beneath his composure. It had the distinct shape of shame. Whether it would mature into real remorse or harden into defensive anger, I couldn't say. Some seeds are planted, and you simply have to walk away without knowing what they'll eventually grow into. The hallway stayed silent. Emmett hadn't moved or spoken a single word since the elevator doors opened. He stood behind the wheelchair, one hand resting lightly on the handle, maintaining the same steady, unyielding presence he'd offered all week. He wasn't putting on a show of restraint. He simply understood that this conversation wasn't his to lead. The most valuable thing he could offer was his quiet support. Clifton reached out and took the envelope. He didn't open it. He just held it at his side, staring down at me. I hadn't seen that look on his face since he was 9 years old, caught dead to rights doing something he couldn't explain away. Beneath the adult polish was something raw and small. Something that, if we had both known how to handle it back then, might have been the start of a very different relationship. But we hadn't. That was a reality we both carried, and I had stopped pretending otherwise around day 3 in room 318. He stared at me for a long moment. Then, with his free hand, he grabbed his carry-on bag, turned around, and walked toward the elevators at the end of the hall. He pressed the call button. The doors slid open almost instantly, as if the building itself had been waiting for the moment to resolve. He stepped inside without looking back. The doors closed. The corridor returned to what it had been before. White walls, cool fluorescent light, the faint, distant hum of monitors from another wing. It was the quiet stillness of a place where heavy chapters close without any grand spectacle. Emmett stood still for a second, then walked around to the side of the wheelchair. He crouched down slightly, so his eyes were level with mine, making a quiet, subtle adjustment to meet me face to face. "You all right?" he asked. I answered slowly, not out of hesitation, but because the question deserved a real answer, not a quick brush-off. "Getting there," I said. He gave a single nod, stood back up, and placed his back on the wheelchair handles. We stayed in the hallway for another minute, just the two of us, the quiet lights and the stillness. Then Emmett slowly turned the chair back toward room 318, and we moved on. By the time Emmett wheeled me back through the door, Rosalind had already set up my dinner tray. She looked at us for a single second, a professional scan that took in both of us, the quality of the silence between us, and the quiet resolution on our faces. Then she placed the tray on the table, picked up her clipboard, and walked out without asking a single question. An observant person always knows when a room has already said everything it needs to say. I let Emmett help me back into bed, leaning against the pillows. I looked at the dinner tray without much of an appetite, but my kidney required regular sustenance, whether I felt like eating or not. And Rosalind had planned accordingly. Right portions, right temperature. A meal that delivered its message of recovery without any extra fluff. Fine, wine. I picked up the fork with my left hand, my mind drifting back to that phone call from Cancun. Serena calling me Raymond. I'd corrected her in the moment and moved on, filing it away as just another minor detail. But now, sitting in the quiet room, as twilight spilled through the window, I found myself looking at it through a completely different lens. She had been married to my son for 3 years. She had sat at my kitchen table. Over the last 2 years, she'd joined us for our single annual family dinner at a restaurant in Market Square. A meal where I paid for everything, right down to the parking. 3 years of close proximity, yet she hadn't hesitated to use the wrong name. It wasn't because she forgot. It was because she'd never bothered to learn it in the first place. There's a world of difference between not knowing a man's name and not needing to know it. The first is just a lapse in memory. The second is a clear choice about what information actually matters to you. Serena knew my net worth, the revenue structure of my company, the approximate value of my estate, and the broad legal framework Tennessee uses for corporate asset inheritance. She knew all of that. She just didn't know my name. Those two facts, side by side, laid everything bare, far more clearly than any document in Barnaby's 14-page report ever could. My phone chimed on the mattress. Mortimer, I picked it up. Theodore. His voice carried that distinct tone he used whenever he had information he wished he didn't have to deliver, but was obligated to share. I have one more piece for you. I set the fork down. Go ahead. After Serena visited my office 3 weeks ago, I took it upon myself to hire a private investigator, Mortimer said. His report came in this afternoon. What did he find? Serena registered for a research card at Hodges Library on the UT campus 11 months ago, Mortimer explained. In Tennessee, state library access logs are public record if requested through the right channels. She checked out materials on state inheritance law, living trusts, and corporate succession planning. She returned to review additional files 3 separate times after that. The room was dead silent. He also dug up an old professional profile from about 4 years ago, before she met Clifton, Mortimer continued. Back then, she reached out to 7 attorneys specializing in estate planning across Tennessee, asking about entry-level positions and research opportunities in asset administration. A brief pause hung over the line. This wasn't a sudden curiosity, Theodore. It was a strategy. I turned my eyes toward the window. Night had fully fallen over Knoxville. The city lights flickering against the darkness, amber and gold cutting through the cold November night. There's one more detail, Mortimer added. The investigator cross-referenced the timeline of when Clifton and Serena started dating. It was exactly 4 months after Merit Logistics signed the Vanderbilt distribution contract, the largest deal in our company's history. That contract made the front page of the Knoxville Business Journal that March. He let the fact rest for a beat. Their first recorded meeting was that July. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Theodore. I heard you, Mortimer, I said softly. Thank you for letting me know. I hung up and set the phone back on the mattress. Emmett was sitting in the corner chair, right where he'd been since we returned from the hallway. He didn't ask about the call. He just waited, giving the moment room to breathe before asking for anything. I looked over at him. For 3 years, I sent $8,000 a month to that woman. I said, thinking I was helping my son build a foundation for his future. Turns out I was funding a slow-motion takeover. Emmett didn't offer any platitudes. He simply stood up, walked across the room, and placed a firm hand on my shoulder for a brief second. It wasn't an act of pity or a dramatic gesture, just the steady, quiet presence of a man who understood that some truths don't need commentary, just acknowledgement. Then he took his hand away and sat back down. It was enough. It was more than enough. After a moment, I said, the formal notices go out tomorrow morning. 2 letters, one to Clifton, one to Serena. Different terms, different outcomes. Emmett gave a single nod. I finished enough of my dinner to satisfy the medical staff, pushed the tray aside, and reached over to turn off the bedside lamp. The room dimmed, leaving only the amber glow of Knoxville's city lights filtering through the window. The city went about its evening rhythm, cool, constant, holding a quiet beauty that didn't demand an audience. I looked over at Emmett in the dim light. The copper bracelet was on his wrist. He'd put it on at some point during the evening without making a fuss. It sat comfortably against the skin of his left wrist, the worn metal catching the soft light from the window with a natural ease, like an object that had finally found where it belonged. 27 years tucked away in my wallet, then in my pocket, then held tight in a dark hospital room. And now, it was right where it was always meant to be. It had just taken me 27 years, three fractured ribs, and a kidney that had survived a very hard week to see things clearly enough to make it happen. I woke up before Rosalind arrived, and not from the pain. The ribs had settled into a manageable ache, and the kidney had stabilized into a quiet routine. I woke up simply because my body had gotten the rest it needed, coming to a peaceful stop. It felt like a room settling into quiet after everyone who needed to speak had finally said their piece. It was 6:47 a.m. on a Friday morning in late November. The phone on the bedside table was dark. No new notifications, no missed calls piling up in the corner of the screen. No names I had to mentally brace myself to see. Just a plain black rectangle sitting quietly on the table, offering nothing because nothing was asked of it. I left it there and turned to look out the window. The early morning light over Knoxville in late November has a quality I've never quite been able to put into words, even after living here for 64 years. The light doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in subtle layers. First, a soft, muted gray that makes the buildings look like they're deciding whether to appear. Then, a thin band of rose and amber cuts along the eastern skyline, with the Great Smoky Mountains showing up as a dark, irregular line against the horizon. The mountains don't announce themselves. They're just there, ancient, solid, and completely indifferent to whether anyone is watching. I've always found a deep, genuine comfort in that kind of indifference. Things that don't demand your attention to exist have always felt far more trustworthy than things that do. I watched the light shift across the skyline for a long while, without focusing on anything in particular. It was the first morning all week I'd managed to just sit still, and it felt like a piece of myself I hadn't realized was missing until it quietly returned. At 7:30, Rosalind walked in carrying my morning medication and the blood pressure cuff she used every day, without being asked. She took one look at my face, just as she had every morning this week, reading what was actually there rather than what she expected to find. She paused at the side of the bed. "You look different this morning, Mr. Merritt," she said. "I slept," I said. "That helps," she said, setting the blood pressure cuff on the side table. She went about her routine with the efficient calm she brought to everything. I mean, really slept. Not that shallow half-rest where your body is lying flat, but your mind is running in circles somewhere else. "Really slept," I confirmed. She gave a brief nod of satisfaction and moved to the next item on her checklist without further comment. Rosalind didn't dwell on good news any longer than she did on bad news. She noted it, adjusted, and kept moving. Over the course of the week, I'd come to appreciate that consistency as one of her most useful qualities. A message from Mortimer arrived at 7:19 a.m., right as I was watching the morning light catch the dark ridge of the mountains. Both delivered. Courier's confirmed signatures at 7:05 and 7:11. "It's done, Theodore," I read it twice. then laid the phone down and watched the light continue its slow spread across the city's rooftops and the bare branches along the hospital drive. It's done. The phrase carried a different weight than I'd expected. Not heavy and not entirely light, either. Just clean. Like opening a window in a long-closed room after a harsh winter and letting the air move freely for the first time in months. No drama, no spectacle. Just the quiet sense that things were as they ought to be. Emmett called at 8:10 a.m. In the background, I could hear the steady rumble of a truck engine. He was already on the road, heading toward the Riverbend terminal. That meant he'd been up since dawn, moving through his morning the way he always did, handling the next practical task without making a fuss about it. "How are you feeling this morning?" he asked. "Like a man who got a full night's sleep," I said. "Good." A brief pause followed, filled with the hum of road noise. "Theodore, I'm activating the trust today." "I know," I said. "Go get to work. It's your company now." The silence on his end lasted longer than I expected. "Yes, sir," he said softly. "Stop calling me, sir." Another pause, longer this time. Not out of hesitation, but the quiet stillness of a man recalibrating a habit he'd held for decades, making sure the new tone felt right before speaking it out. Loud. "All right," he said. "Theodore." "That's better," I said. He ended the call, and I sat in the quiet for a moment, realizing I meant every word. It wasn't just a correction of titles. It was a simple, accurate description of the shift that had taken place in room 318 between Tuesday morning and Friday dawn. Some distances close very slowly over time, and then, when the moment comes, they close all at once. Nadine Cobb walked in at 8:45 a.m., carrying a breakfast tray. Oatmeal, orange juice, and a cup of coffee that was nearly the right temperature. She set it on the bedside table and gave me that sharp, direct look she'd used since Tuesday morning, when she'd asked if I wanted to talk or needed her to pretend she didn't see a thing. "Well, look at you," she said. "You look like a man who finally put down a heavy load." "Put down something I should have laid aside 10 years ago," I said. She handed me the glass of juice with the practiced ease of a nurse who had seen 100 versions of this conversation and knew precisely how they ended. "Better late than never. Now eat before it gets cold." She walked out before I could answer. She was entirely right. At 9:15 a.m., I picked up the phone and took one last look at the screen. No missed calls, no unread texts, just the time, the date, and a weather display showing 43 degrees in Knoxville, Tennessee. Crisp, clear, and completely ordinary in every way that didn't involve what had transpired inside this room over the past few days. I turned the phone face down on the table and left it there. Outside, the morning was in full swing. The mountains held the eastern horizon, and the city below was moving at its own steady pace, entirely indifferent to everything that had been decided, signed, delivered, and spoken in this small space. I'd always appreciated that about cities. They keep moving regardless. The mountains do the same. And I was learning that maybe I ought to as well. I didn't know where Clifton was when the courier delivered the envelope at 7:05 a.m. on Friday. Maybe in that West Knoxville apartment. The one where $8,000 a month had helped maintain a comfortable illusion for 10 years. Maybe somewhere else entirely. I had no way of knowing. And sitting in room 318, with the morning light filling the window, I realized I was completely at peace with not knowing. When you stop structuring your life around someone else's choices, that information ceases to be necessary. 6 minutes later, Serena received her envelope at a separate address. I didn't know that location either. Mortimer's courier handled the logistics, freeing me from the need to track the details. All I cared about was that Clifton read his letter alone, without anyone standing over him to intercept his initial reaction, reshape it before it's settled, or whisper convenient rationalizations before he had a chance to digest what was written on the page. Whatever effect those words were going to have, they needed to reach him directly, unedited by anyone else's agenda. I had written it on Tuesday night, somewhere past 11 in the quiet of room 318. The air vent overhead was still rattling softly because Rosalind hadn't yet arrived to file the work order that would fix it by morning. My right arm was immobilized in a cast, and my left hand produced a script that looked less like my normal handwriting and more like a rough approximation. The letters were slightly uneven, the lines across the page not entirely straight. But the words said exactly what needed to be said, which mattered far more than penmanship. I'd written letters my whole life, but never one like that. I started by laying out the past decade. $8,000 a month. 120 months. The total number wasn't the main point. I'd spent more than that on fleet upgrades at Riverbend in a single quarter without a second thought. The point was what that money had represented over all those years, and what I had used it to avoid facing. It wasn't love. I saw that clearly now, with the unvarnished honesty that comes when a hospital room leaves you with nothing to do but look at the truth. It was guilt, the specific, heavy guilt of a father watching his son drift into someone he hardly recognized, yet choosing day after day, year after year, to write checks, instead of sitting down to speak the hard truth when it mattered most. That was my own failure, entirely separate from anything that had happened this week. I wrote it out plainly, without softening the edges or dressing it up in forgiving language. He deserved the direct version. I wrote less about Serena. I simply stated that I bore her no malice. I understood ambition. I understood ambition after 31 years of building a business from the ground up. I knew what it was to target a goal and work systematically toward it. But spending 11 months researching estate law to claim what someone else had spent a lifetime positioning to what someone else had spent a lifetime building, that was a choice. And choices carry consequences that belong entirely to the person who makes them. If nothing else, I wanted her to see that clearly. Then I brought it back to Clifton. I love you. I love you, the way a man loves the child he raised, watching you grow through every stage of who you were and who you became along the way. That hasn't changed, and it won't. But love isn't a financial transaction, Clifton. For 10 years, I confused the two. I kept paying because it was easier than having a real conversation, easier than admitting I was buying a version of a relationship that didn't require either of us to be honest. That ends today. For both of us, I told him the house in Maryville was his. 3 bedrooms, a private dock on the water, built solid on a good foundation, valued at $420,000. Transferred cleanly, free of conditions or strings attached. What you build from here is entirely up to you. It always was. That's what I should have told you the first time you asked me for money as an adult, instead of just reaching for the checkbook. I'm telling you now, later than it should have been, but it's the truth. And you were always worth more than just another check. I don't know what Clifton did after he finished reading the letter. I don't know how long he sat with it, where he was when he reached the final line, or what thought first crossed his mind in the silence that followed. I made a deliberate choice not to spend time imagining it. Some things need to land where they fall, without the person who sent them standing over the outcome. What I do know is that he didn't call me, and for the first time in 10 years, that silence felt like the proper resolution rather than a problem I needed to fix, manage, or fill. There was nothing left for me to do about it. It was a strange feeling, but to my own mild surprise, I found I didn't mind it at all. The rest came from Emmett later on. He told it the way he told most things, plain, unvarnished, laying out the facts in the exact order they happened. On Friday afternoon, his phone chimed with an incoming call at the Riverbend terminal. Clifton's name showed on the display. Emmett looked at the screen. He didn't answer it. He set the phone face down on the desk. His desk now, in the main office at Riverbend, and went right back to the open file he'd been reviewing before the ring interrupted him. The phone didn't ring a second time, and in the telling of this story, that was the last time I had any reason to speak the name Clifton Merritt. 2 weeks later, I sat in my truck parked in the lot outside the Riverbend Industrial Park, looking up at the building. I didn't go inside, I just watched. The doctor had cleared me for light activity 3 days earlier. The kidney had stabilized as planned. The ribs were mending on schedule. And the cast on my right arm had been replaced with a lighter brace that allowed more movement than I'd had since the crash on Kingston Pike. It was the first time in 2 weeks. It was the first time in the driver's seat of my own vehicle. I hadn't driven it there. I'd asked a neighbor to bring it over so I could sit in it. When you've spent 14 days in a hospital room, you do things like that to remember what ordinary feels like. As it turned out, ordinary felt a lot like a parking lot at 5:30 p.m. on a cold December afternoon. The building looked exactly as it always had, practical, unadorned, built for heavy work rather than showing off. The Merritt Logistics sign above the main entrance had needed a fresh coat of paint for 2 years. I'd meant to schedule it, but kept putting it off for other priorities. Looking at it from the truck, I decided that was Emmett's decision now. He could repaint it, or he could leave it as it was. Either way, it was his sign. The lights were still on in the top floor office. I knew they would be. Emmett had been working late every evening since the transfer was finalized. Barnaby had mentioned it in his routine weekly update. Not because I'd asked, but because after 19 years, Barnaby understood I'd want to know without having to bring it up. The legal transition had concluded the previous Friday morning. Barnaby's confirmation message had arrived at 9:15 a.m. A short, precise note in his typical style, stating that the transfer of 75% controlling interest in Merritt Logistics to Emmett Caldwell was complete and officially recorded. I'd read it on my phone in room 318, while looking out at the Knoxville skyline, feeling nothing beyond a quiet, uncomplicated satisfaction that things were finally where they belonged. I had spent 31 years building that company. I'd started with 4 employees, 1 used flat bed, and a small rented space in the same park before we outgrew it and moved into the current building. I built it through quarters that worried me and quarters that didn't. Through contracts won and contracts lost. Through the slow accumulation of steady effort that doesn't look like much in any given year, but turns into something substantial when you step back to view the whole picture. 31 years, and now it belonged to the man who had been protecting it from the inside. Unasked, unpaid, and without ever presenting a bill for his loyalty over all the years I'd known him. Sitting in that truck, with the winter chill coming through the vents, watching those office lights, I felt a deep sense of relief. In fact, it felt entirely right. At 6:15 p.m., the front door opened. Emmett walked out wearing his heavy canvas work jacket and safety vest, a leather file folder tucked under his arm. He moved across the asphalt at his usual unhurried, purposeful pace. He was 3 rows into the lot before he spotted my truck. He stopped and looked at it for a full second, taking it in, calculating, doing that quick mental check he always did before responding to anything. Then he walked straight over and opened the passenger door without asking. "You shouldn't be driving," he said, stepping inside. "I've been sitting here since 5:30, I replied. "Haven't moved an inch." He looked through the windshield at the building, then over at me, then back at the entrance. "Why didn't you come inside?" "Didn't need to," I said. "Just wanted to see it." He accepted the answer without pushback, which was the proper response. Between two people who have known each other long enough, some things don't require elaborate explanations. He understood, without me saying it, that sometimes you need to view a thing from a distance to fully grasp what you spent a lifetime building. We sat in silence for a while, as the parking lot gradually emptied around us. The other businesses in the park closed up for the day, their headlights cutting through the early December dusk. Above the door, the Merit Logistics sign caught the last faint traces of daylight. "You want me to drive you home?" he asked after a few minutes. "In a bit," I said. Another comfortable quiet settled over us, the same quiet we'd shared off and on since Tuesday afternoon in room 318, when he'd brought 2 coffees from the cafeteria and spoken 5 plain words instead of the usual hospital platitudes. After a moment, I said, "Emmett, yeah? Yeah? You're going to build it better than I did." He didn't deflect or offer a polite denial. That reflexive, "Oh, I don't know about that." People used to manage expectations rather than speak their mind. He looked at the building for a second, then said, "I'll try." That was the right answer. Not out of modesty, Emmett wasn't performing humility, but out of accuracy. He would try. And trying was what he'd done every single day, for years when no one was watching, no logs were being kept, and no praise was offered. With the certainty of a man who had observed him for 24 years, I knew that trying would be more than enough. 3 weeks after leaving the hospital, I sat on the front porch of my house in North Knoxville with a cup of coffee, no particular schedule on my calendar. The wrist brace was gone, cleared by the doctor 4 days prior. The bone had set cleanly, and the follow-up scans were clear. The only remaining instruction was to take it easy with my right hand for a few more weeks and avoid heavy lifting. The ribs had settled into a state where they no longer demanded constant attention. They only reminded me of their presence if I moved too quickly or took a sudden deep breath. A dull, manageable ache rather than the sharp test of that first week. It was predictable and easy enough to handle. December in Knoxville was doing what it always does: cold, dry, and straightforward. It wasn't the kind of winter that put on a dramatic show with heavy storms. It just arrived and settled in, practical and unhurried. Folks around here call it real cold, as opposed to the theatrical kind, and I'd always respected that quality about it. The maple tree in the front yard was completely bare now. Back in November, it had held onto its amber leaves, long after it made practical sense. Now, its branches stretched cleanly against the gray December sky. Sparsus, unadorned, holding a simple beauty that didn't need anything extra to justify itself. I sat holding my coffee, looking at those branches, and thought about regret. It's easy to replay choices, running alternate versions of events until you memorize every exit you didn't take. I'd done enough of that over my life to know how it feels and where it leads. This was something else entirely. Clarity. When you step back far enough from a situation to view it whole, the true shape of it becomes obvious. 8 missed calls on a Tuesday morning had turned into 21 by Wednesday, and then shifted into nothing at all, a silence that began as an absence and gradually turned into resolution. By Friday morning, it didn't feel like a loss anymore. It felt like the proper conclusion to a specific chapter. A copper bracelet that had stayed tucked in my wallet for 27 years was now on the wrist of the man who should have been wearing it all along. It had simply taken a box truck running a red light at Kingston Pike and North Shore to finally move it from one place to the other. Barnaby had continued sending weekly updates about Merit Logistics, not because I requested them, but because he was Barnaby, and he understood I'd want to know without having to ask. In Emmett's first full month leading the company, revenue was up 4% over the same period last year. I read the figure, set the phone down, and felt nothing beyond a simple satisfaction at having made the right call on something that mattered. I had been right about Emmett Caldwell for 33 years. It felt good to see the official records finally reflect that truth. I visited the Lenora Merit Literacy Foundation on a Tuesday afternoon. It was my first time standing outside that building in South Knoxville since before Lenora passed. I didn't go inside. I just stood on the sidewalk, looking through the front window at people sitting around tables with workbooks open, a volunteer moving quietly between them. It was a focused, quiet space, a place where adults were working hard to learn skills they wished they'd gained earlier in life. Beside the entrance sat a small brass plaque engraved with her name. I stood there for 15 minutes, maybe a bit longer, before walking back to my car. It was enough. More than enough. In fact, a solid sense of completion that left no room for lingering doubts. What remained, after all of this, wasn't what I would have predicted 27 years ago. Standing in a hospital hallway, making a promise I didn't yet know how to keep. It wasn't just the business, though the company was in better hands than it had ever been. It wasn't the legal paperwork, though those documents had spoken clearly and would continue to hold up. That began with a box truck, and it wasn't even the left-handed signature week, and ended with a left-handed signature in blue ink across 17 pages. What remained was a kitchen in North Knoxville on a Saturday morning 27 years ago. A 6-year-old boy sitting at the table at 2 a.m. over a bowl of cereal, asking a question far too heavy for a child his age. "What do we do now, Uncle Theodore?" What remained was a copper bracelet, a quiet pledge made to a woman in a hospital corridor who knew she might not walk out of that building. A promise fulfilled late, imperfectly, and after 27 years of delay, but fulfilled nonetheless. That afternoon, Emmett came by the house. He brought coffee, made right, without having to be asked at the proper temperature. He sat on the porch steps beside my chair, and we watched the bare maple tree against the gray December sky, saying very little because there was nothing left that needed to be spelled out. The copper bracelet on his wrist caught the flat winter sunlight. The clasp was worn smooth, the metal aged into a deep, soft amber, the look of an object that had weathered plenty of seasons without losing its fundamental shape. I looked at it, and thought to myself that Lenora would have been pleased. Then I took a sip of my coffee. Outside, Knoxville moved through December, as it always does. Steady, indifferent, keeping its own pace, completely unconcerned with the quiet shifts that had taken place inside a house on the north side of town over the past few weeks. I'd always liked that about this city. It keeps moving. It doesn't wait around, and it doesn't ask you to put your life on display. It just carries on. And so do I. If you're building something real, something that takes years of effort and real sacrifice to sustain, make sure the person who takes the reins is the one who was already doing the work when no one was watching. Not just a name on a piece of paper, but the person who actually shows up. That is the one absolute truth I took away from my week in room 318. Everything else is just numbers on a page. This is my family's story. Not every chapter is something to be proud of, but it is honest. I spent 10 years writing checks instead of having hard conversations, calling it love, calling it keeping the peace. Looking back now from a porch in North Knoxville with a cup of coffee and mended ribs, I see what it really was. Avoidance disguised as parental guilt. Don't make the mistake I made. Don't wait until you're lying in a hospital bed facing a week of silence to acknowledge what you've known deep down all along. Don't let the people who quietly show up, the ones who never demand a price for their loyalty, be sidelined just because keeping the peace feels easier than standing up for the truth. In the end, justice was never about money, or the company, or the evidence sitting in a manila envelope. Justice was simply choosing to see reality clearly and having the courage to act on what was right.